Welcome, everybody. It's 11 a.m. Eastern, noon Atlantic time on my clock. So we'll get started with a couple of housekeeping items and let people filter in over the first couple of minutes. My name is Peter Chaurier. I'm the Key Biodiversity Area Assessment and Outreach Coordinator at WCS Canada. Very excited to introduce all of our panelists one by one here. We'll get started with that in a second, but just to start off by saying a couple of housekeeping items. One, we'll be recording the talk to post on our KBA Canada website afterwards. So keep that in mind. You won't have access to turn on your video and mic until the question period at the end of today's presentations. But do keep in mind that the talk's being recorded if you do want to turn on your camera and microphone. If you have questions throughout the presentations, please drop them in the chat and we'll get to them at the end of the presentations, or save them to the end and you'll be able to ask them yourself as well at the end. And finally, we are recording the talk and we'll send a link out as well to all of the Eventbrite RSVP registrants. So you'll get a notice whenever that's online in the next couple of days, or send any one of us an email and we'll be able to direct to me and I'll send you a link as well directly. I think that's all the housekeeping items for today. I'll pass it right over to Ciara Raudsepp-Hearne to start us off.
Thank you very much, Peter. So I'm Ciara Raudsepp-Hearne. I'm the National Director of Key Biodiversity Areas at Wildlife Conservation Society Canada. Thanks to everyone for coming today. So I'm going to start off the session today with just a short introduction to the Key Biodiversity Area Initiative. I won't have time to get into all the details because it's more important that you hear about the work that's actually going on in Nova Scotia. So if you do have questions, and you know, I'm only going to be touching on sort of the main points, please do write them in the chat, or if anyone wants to hear about anything related to this initiative in more depth, we are always available for phone calls or follow-up meetings as well. It's really, this participation in this work is key because the more people that are involved and the more people who understand what this is and what it means and what it doesn't mean, the more likely that it can be a powerful tool for stewardship or conservation. So without further ado, Key Biodiversity Areas is the topic of our meeting today. We have been working on key biodiversity areas for a couple of years now, but the first few years have really been about trying to make sense of this very new tool that's being used at the global scale. And now it's becoming more prominent in Canada as well. So then we started to hire people who could start scoping out in different regions, where are the key biodiversity areas likely to be? And that's where we're at. So we have scoped out a whole bunch of key biodiversity areas in Atlantic Canada with the help of some fantastic scientists in Nova Scotia and in other provinces as well. And we are now wanting to make sure that everyone can be involved. So the key biodiversity areas, it's a very specific thing. It's not just areas that are generally important for biodiversity. The definition at the global scale is these are sites that contribute to the persistence of biodiversity. So they're critical to biodiversity in some way. And usually what that means, because this is site-scaled conservation, is that there's a high concentration of a particular biodiversity element in a particular place. So a certain percentage of a species that may be threatened or maybe rare, or a place where species aggregate in huge numbers, and so they really rely on that particular site for their persistence, or same thing for ecosystems. So this is a tool that was developed by a whole global partnership led by IUCN. They tested and developed the criteria, which are all quantitative, over the course of 12 years, and released the Key Biodiversity Area Standard in 2016. The standard showed there's 5 main criteria for being a key biodiversity area, and the standard includes all the rules about what can qualify and what doesn't qualify. And there's an accompanying guideline book that tells you all about data standards and how to delineate sites and all the different rules. So we're following these global rules, but because we're one of the first countries that's doing this work on a big scale, we're also able to provide a lot of feedback to the global partnership out there on, you know, lessons learned, tools, approaches. And so Canada is quite a leader when it comes to key biodiversity areas. So the 5 criteria generally are threatened biodiversity, which includes threatened species and ecosystems, geographically restricted species and ecosystems, sites with the highest ecological integrity in the world. And these are slightly weird sites because they're huge. They'll all be in mostly northern Canada. So sites that can accommodate ecological processes, so fire regimes and different kinds of cycles. Sites that are important for biological processes. So this includes things like migratory stopover sites or caribou calving grounds or bat hibernacula or snake hibernacula. So it's where species gather in enormous numbers. And then finally, there's a criterion that we're not really employing at the moment, which is irreplaceability through quantitative analysis, and that's still being tested and developed. But we're sort of seeing that the sites that are captured by criterion E, are already captured by the other criteria. So we'll see how that one develops. And just to give you an example of the thresholds, for each criterion has a quantitative threshold. So a site, if a species is critically endangered or G1 in the nature served system, you need 0.5% of the global or the national population present at the site for it to qualify as a KBA. Not threatened, so criterion B is not for threatened species or ecosystems, it's just for species that are really clumped in space or quite rare or endemic. And so you need 10% of the population of the species to be found at the site for it to qualify. So that's to give you some ideas. We can talk about that after, and certainly others will give you some examples of sites in Nova Scotia that are qualifying as KBAs. So this is just there's a global standard that was released in 2016, as I mentioned, but then Canada also developed a national standard, which is a pretty conservative adaptation of the global standard. We're using both standards in coordination so we're identifying both global KBAs and national KBAs. And the reason that we wanted to develop the national standard was because the global standard doesn't capture some of Canada's conservation priorities. For example, you can only identify KBAs for species at the full species level. So that would mean we'd have to assess all caribou, including barren ground caribou and woodland caribou and reindeer, all as one species. So one of the adaptations of the national standard is that we can apply the standard to infraspecies. So if it's a well-described and distinct population, according to bodies like COSEWIC, we're able to apply the national standard to those. So as a tool for conservation, it's becoming more and more well known, even though, again, it's a very new tool. It's seen as a very scientifically robust and credible tool because it is fully quantitative, and it's just there's so many rules that it doesn't really matter who's doing the work. If something qualifies as a KBA and there's evidence for that, it is a KBA, and there's no negotiation there. So because of this sort of strength, the Pathway to Canada Target 1 process asked all jurisdictions to identify key biodiversity areas, and that was sort of the birth of the Key Biodiversity Area program in Canada, although it built on decades of knowledge held at Birds Canada and Nature Canada on important bird and biodiversity areas, which are quite similar in terms of the standard and the criteria. And all those important bird and biodiversity sites are being crosswalked into the KBA system by Birds Canada. And so that's a wonderful sort of base upon which to now identify all the other sites for all the other taxonomic groups and ecosystems. So it's an information layer. There's no management prescription, no impact on access to land. It's not negotiated. The process is regionally focused. There's no new research going on. We're identifying places that are often already known to communities, but now they will get international and national recognition. All the spatial layers and all the information and all the ancillary data will all be publicly available to everyone. And just a quick note to say that this is one tool. It's a very strong tool, and people really find a lot of trust in it, and that it's capturing places that some of them are well known, some of them are absolutely not known, but it is not capturing everything. You have to understand that it has to be used in complement with other tools that capture other values that are important to communities and to biologists as well. I won't go through this, but just to say that we have quite a large partnership out there. So there's a lot of NGOs that are all working together. There's a lot of, we also work with governments at the provincial scale, territorial scale, national scale, as well as, Indigenous communities and nations. Anyone who finds interest in this tool is welcome to participate, and we would like to invite you all in. So far identified about 450 new KBAs. They're mostly in draft form. So there's a long review process that we reach out to people who should be involved and say, hey, take a look at this. What do you think? Are the boundaries correct? Is the information correct? And it's very much, so far, there's hundreds, if not thousands of people who've been involved, working sort of slowly. It's quite a slow process to add in information and to create these very strong proposals. There's also quite a lot of research going on to help with this work, and all of that information is freely available as well. And yeah, all sorts of sort of data layers and road networks, etc. We think that we'll cover about 10% of Canada by the time this work is finished, but there will always be new KBAs to be identified as new data becomes available, as unfortunately species or ecosystems become threatened. So this work will continue. What we're trying to do in the first few years is to identify the bulk of sites that there is data available for and that we can identify at this time. The process is led by local coordinators who sort of do the scoping work, because they're the few people in Canada who are trained in depth in the methods and approaches. And so they can sort of figure out, well, what might qualify. And at that point, when they have some draft sites and some potential KBAs, that's when they reach out to knowledge holders. Any form of knowledge is very much welcome. If people want to give it, it's certainly not required. But then you reach out, talk to experts, talk to different kinds of knowledge holders, talk to people who know the sites, and that's how the sites then are developed. So as I mentioned before, there's lots of review process, and the work is often slow and it's additive. So there's multiple opportunities to add knowledge to these proposals. So I'm going to end there, and then we'll have a number of people talk about the specifics in relation to Nova Scotia. But I just want to thank especially the Atlantic Canada KBA coordinators, so Colin Chapman currently, and then Ciara Robinson in the past, the Atlantic Canada Conservation Data Centre, which has been absolutely integral to this work. And then the Nova Scotia KBA Committee, which includes Sean Basquill, Dave McKinnon, and Claire Wilson O'Driscoll. And we'll be hearing from Sean a bit later today. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ciara. Colin, we'll have Colin next up. Colin is our, as Ciara just mentioned, our Atlantic Canada Key Biodiversity Area Coordinator at WCS Canada. So he's leading the work to identify new KBAs and build on the progress that's already been made of identifying key biodiversity areas in Atlantic Canada. Colin, take it away.
All right, I'll just share my screen. Okay, there we go. Yeah, so I'm Colin Chapman. Going to be going over, just giving you an overview of the key biodiversity areas in development in Nova Scotia. Here we just have pictured a couple of locations in one of our key biodiversity areas, and I'll go in depth on that one a little bit later. Okay. So yeah, we have over 65 proposed KBAs in the province. This includes 24 KBAs that are solely for birds that are being crosswalked from important bird areas to key biodiversity areas. I don't have those maps except for the ones where I'm involved, including other non-bird key non-bird diversity, like here in Briar Island and Sable Island, for example. Of these 65, over 65 KBAs in the works, we have 12 that are near the general review stage, 9 that are in technical review as we speak, and the remainder being in various stages of development, from very preliminary works to almost ready for technical review. The taxonomic coverage of our KBA so far, I think, Ciara mentioned that Birds Canada is leading work on birds. From my non-bird specialist perspective, it seems like piping plumber is a big one in our region, but I won't get into that anymore because my work focuses on everything else. Vascular plants are more or less the more completely known taxonomic group in the region, and they're well represented well represented in the KBAs that we have. So yeah, most of our KBAs are vascular plant focused. We also have several for mussels. We have Atlantic mudpiddock in the Minas Basin here, and a few for yellow lamp mussel in the Sydney region over here. I believe we just have a single key biodiversity area for fish, which is the Atlantic whitefish, endemic to the Petite Riviere lakes over here. Invertebrates, I believe we just have the Sable Island KBA, which has several invertebrates endemic to Sable Island. Vertebrates, we have a few proposed for those, like for Eastern ribbon snake. And then I hate to put it at the last because I study lichens myself, but lichens, we have several lichen KBAs in development, which I started myself when I began with WCS Canada in April. And we have several of those primarily, in the southwest of the province, and some further along in what we call the boreal felt lichen belt. So let's just hone in on Keswick here, the southwest corner, and I'll give you more of an overview of the KBAs we have in no particular order, maybe just in a clockwise fashion. This is Briar Island here. Like I mentioned, this one was a bird KBA, and we're adding a vascular plant trigger to it, so Eastern Mountain Avens. This here is Bellevaux Lake, key biodiversity area for coastal sweet pepperbush and spotted pondweed. A couple prototype quillwort lakes here, Kejimkujik National Park. We have a lot of important vascular plant focused ones in this area. Atlantic coastal plain flora spots like Carrigan Lake, Pretty Mary, Mudflat, and Mill Lakes. We have Ponhook, Malega, Shingle Lakes here. This is the Petite Riviere lakes that I mentioned with the endemic Atlantic whitefish, which is in these lakes and nowhere else in the world. It used to be in the Tusket system, but thought to be locally extinct there. Fancy Lake, nice fancy spot, nice important spot for golden crest. LaHave, Medway, and Roseway River estuaries for Eastern Liliopsis. Several important key areas for tubercled spikerush at Great Pumnico Lake, Barrington Lake, Harper's Lake, Golden Western Lakes. Just a very rough placeholder delineation here for a key area for several lichen species. I'm actually working on that with some lichen experts as we speak, and happy to have more input on that, but that's generally an important area from Middle Ohio to Sable River, Port Joli, Port Libre area. Also a few bog sites delineated for threadleaf sundew and peat moss, a nationally rare peat moss, Sphagnum cyclophyllum. But this one is for the plant, Quinn's Meadow, Port Latour bogs, as well as West Backrow bogs. This one is within a bird KBA that is these two, but we have a bog site delineated within there. And last but not least, the Tusket River and Estuary KBA. I wanted to highlight this one because it's so important nationally, just because of the sheer number of triggers we have there, but as well because it's just such a large one and can involve a lot of different stakeholders. And this is just a really good one to highlight for cooperation and discussion. So let's jump into that one a little bit. There we go. Yeah, so the Tusket River and Estuary KBA, as currently proposed, encompasses portions of 3 rivers, the Tusket, Annis, and Carleton. The tidal estuary, where they converge, as well as associated salt marshes, mudflats, and nearshore islands. We used ecologically relevant boundaries here. So, on the seaward end, this has habitat relevant to salt-tolerant species. And landward, this was delineated using a vertical buffer of the lake shores of these lakeshore inhabiting species to grab land that was hydrologically, ecologically relevant to their persistence. As I said, this is a big one. It has, I think, the most triggers, the most vascular plant triggers for sure, of any KBA in Atlantic Canada so far. 11 vascular plants or more, including the entire Canadian population for 5 species. Not only are they, is this area, you know, really important from KBA threshold, from KBA criteria perspective, but a lot of these species are Atlantic coastal plain affiliated, which means the core of their range is the east coast of the United States, from Florida kind of up towards New Jersey, up to Maine sometimes. So being so highly disjunct from the main range of these species suggests that they have an importance, that they house an important genetic component of the species diversity. And actually some genetic studies have shown that some of the species are divergent. So this is an important, really an important area on a global scale as well. Another thought to consider for this key biodiversity area is that, again, it's the northernmost location for a lot of these Atlantic coastal plain species. So as the climate changes, it may remain more suitable than places down in Florida and Georgia, for example.
Just a quick time check, Colin.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. Yep. So just a quick look at some of the important species here. Plymouth gentian, pink coreopsis, eastern bacris, maleberry. These are all species for which the entire Canadian population is within this KBA, and 6 or more with nationally significant populations. I'll just give you a quick overview of the rest of the KBAs in development. Sable Island is not mapped here, but we have the ones in the Minas Basin, Southern Bight, Cobequid Bay, prototype quillwort lakes in the Cobequid Mountains, River Phillip estuary for eastern Liliopsis here, multiple boreal felt lichen spots in Halifax and Guysborough counties, several more boreal felt lichen and New Jersey rush locations between Bishop's Lake, roughly in the Horseshoe Coast Wilderness area. This is just a placeholder that will be replaced with several smaller ones. And then several spots for yellow lamp mussel and one for prototype quillwort. So I'll just put the list of most of the spots in development there, so you can have a quick look and see if there's any that you would like to be involved with or know someone who should be involved with. Or if there's any that you think we're missing, I'm happy to hear about it too. And for your viewing pleasure there, that's just boreal felt lichen and Long's bulrush, 2 triggers in Nova Scotia. All right. Anyway, that's it for me. I can hand it back over to Peter now.
Thank you very much, Colin. Great presentation. Super overview of all the work to date. To focus on the Birds Canada work, Amanda Beco we have from Birds Canada, who is the KBA coordinator at Birds Canada, and is leading the work to reassess the IBAs to the KBA program. Amanda, take it away.
All right, can you see my screen okay?
Looks good, yeah.
No notes, all right, awesome. Well, thanks for having me and thanks for those presentations, Ciara and Colin, very informative. I just want to quickly say that I live and work and play in the traditional territories of Blackfoot Confederacy, Tsuut'ina, Nakota Nations, and Métis Region 3. And I'm still learning a lot about it because I'm kind of new to Alberta, new-ish again. So I just wanted to mention that before I got started, and I'm just going to jump right in. So quickly about important bird and biodiversity areas. They're suite of sites designated for either congregations of birds or threatened species. And we aim to identify, monitor, and conserve these sites where we can. And I won't get into what they are because Ciara mentioned a lot, and a lot of the what KBAs are overlap with what IBAs are, non-regulatory, and the size restrictions and things like that. So I'm just going to keep going. So there's more than 13,000 IBAs globally in almost every country, including terrestrial and marine sites. So it's a worldwide phenomenon, and there's about 40 years of work behind them. So all of this to say that they're kind of a clear foundation to KBAs. And like Ciara said, a lot of them have, a lot of KBAs are actually IBAs that have been reassessed to become KBAs. Again, I won't get into this, but a little bit of the work that Birds Canada is doing as part of this wonderful team is working on the database integration with WCS and NatureServe Canada, working on a new website and registry that will launch in October, we're all really excited about, and then the IBA to KBA crosswalk, which I'll talk about next. So the IBA KBA crosswalk is just us testing basically which IBAs of our 600 sites that were designated in the 90s will become KBAs. So we're one of the first countries to do this, and we really relied on Dean here in the picture to crunch the numbers for us. First, we harvested bird data from Nature Counts, which is our kind of big storage house of data for Birds Canada programs, as well as eBird. And there was about 17 million records that showed up in IBAs across Canada from Nature Counts. Then we updated all the population estimates for birds in Canada using BirdLife International, Partners in Flight, and COSEWIC numbers or estimates. And then we used both of those sets of data to test the KBA criteria for each IBA across Canada, both globally and national criteria. So then for this crosswalk, we just used the species at risk and aggregation criteria, similar to how we assessed IBAs years ago. And so there is opportunity to use other criteria going forward, but we just use those to kind of keep it simple at the beginning. And about 50,000 records met thresholds in around 450 IBAs across Canada. This is the results across Canada, and as you can see, the red ones are global, the blue ones, actually it's hard to see here, but the dark blue ones are national, and then the ones that are gray actually have no KBA trigger data at all. And then the ones outlined in blue are data deficient. So I'll explain what that means in the Nova Scotia context here. So there's 32 presumptive KBAs in Nova Scotia and 12 are data deficient, which means that the data are older than 12 years old, or there's only one year of observation that met the threshold in the last 12 years. So actually Colin went over a lot of these, so I'll just skip that part of my talk, but there's a few that have been updated here if you have seen the IBA map before this, so it'll look a little bit different. And then I see Peter on the screen, so he's going to tell me that I'm done soon. But I'll just say that right now we're, among other things, we're reaching out to experts to update those data deficient sites with new bird data. And we're also reviewing sites internally and externally for nominations. So we're reviewing the boundaries, site summary, numbers, making sure that's all correct. And then we're working with WCS to do boundary changes where there's overlaps from new and existing KBAs. And then we're integrating all those species into one nomination form and database to make it all under one roof. So how can you help this transition? If you have bird data, let me know, contact me if you think you have something that we might not have in Nature Counts. CWS has been a really great source of data for this kind of thing, and also papers that we don't have input into the system. And then you can also help review sites that you've done work in or are familiar with. And you can pass on contacts who might have additional data or an interest in any of these sites. So thank you for listening. I'll pop my email into the chat so that I can you can have it if you would like to contact me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amanda. Great presentation. And if you'd like to see the map, an interactive version of the map that Amanda was showing, I've dropped that in the chat as well. So there's the IBA to KBA crosswalk results map. That's
Thanks, Peter.
Just a couple messages up in the chat. Our last presentation for today is Sean Baskill, who I'll let introduce himself and take it away. Thanks, Sean.
Alrighty, can I get some? Just a moment. All right, does my presentation show up okay?
Looks good, yeah.
Alrighty, yeah, so I am Sean Baskill and I am a biologist. I work for the Wildlife Division of the provincial government in Nova Scotia, and specifically the Department of Natural Resources and Renewables. So yeah, I'd just like to start by thanking WCS for inviting us to participate and to present today. I'm very pleased to be here and to be sharing some of our early thoughts on potential applications of key biodiversity areas, specifically for advancing biodiversity conservation in Nova Scotia. So yeah, I'd like to acknowledge my collaborators. Firstly, Claire Wilson O'Driscoll. Claire is a species at risk biologist, also works for the Wildlife Division in the same department as me. And David McKinnon, he's a conservation planner with the Department of Environment and Climate Change. Looks like my arrow is not going to advance me. There we go. So yeah, I felt compelled to give you a sneak peek of some of the scientific literature. And this is really quite exciting, at least to me. There's been a huge uptake of KBAs, and it's great to see that the conservation community, like the conservation practitioners, are adopting this new way of looking at the landscape. But it's similarly kind of gratifying to see that scientists are also endorsing it. And so we're seeing a lot of different papers coming out. This is just some of the more prominent ones in the past 2 or 3 years. And so ecosystem related KBAs, species KBAs, what do you potentially use those KBAs for? And this paper up here in the top left-hand corner is from the journal Science, which is quite prominent. And I really like that paper because it's not just for protected areas, but also for other types of conservation and how that might be implemented with KBAs. So before I get into some of the specifics, I thought it would be worthwhile giving you folks an overview of our 2 respective departments, provincial government departments, and what our responsibilities are. So firstly, the Department of Environment and Climate Change, they're responsible for planning, establishing, and managing Nova Scotia's full network of wilderness areas and nature reserves, and also for encouraging and supporting private land conservation in the province. The department I work for is responsible for a variety of things, including development, management, conservation, and protection of the various facets of biodiversity, as well as resources such as forest resources, parks resources, mineral, and energy. It's got some pretty pictures there in the bottom, but we can revisit them if we have time. Yeah, I thought it'd be worthwhile kind of getting into a couple of definitions just to set the stage. Even the word biodiversity means different things to different people. In Nova Scotia, we've adopted the definition proposed by the United Nations, and that encompasses the full diversity of species, genes, ecosystems, and habitats, and also the processes that link those various components of biodiversity. And the word conservation also means different things to different people. We take a fairly broad view on that, and I've created this little flower diagram to illustrate that. It doesn't always mean wilderness protection, although that is one example of conservation. It can also mean mitigation, such as in the case of climate change. It can mean stewardship and sustainable use of a particular resource, or restoration and recovery, prevention, intervention, a variety of different things depending on the issue and what's trying to be advanced. So we draw upon different provincial government legislation to get that done or to work towards those goals. And today I'm just going to highlight two of those particular bits of legislation, and those are first the Environmental Goals and Climate Change Reduction Act, and later I'll get into the Biodiversity Act. So this first act was just established last year, and it sets in targets for conservation in terms of protected areas. We are seeking to conserve at least 20% of Nova Scotia. That's land and water mass by the year 2030. And we're seeking to do that using not just legally designated protected areas, but also what are called other effective area-based conservation measures, which is quite a mouthful, but it's a well-used term here in Nova Scotia and elsewhere. And some of those OEACMs include Indigenous protected and conserved areas, and other different tracts of land and protection measures. And we're seeking to set a strategy for doing that with a new strategy that's going to be released in December of next year. So that's kind of exciting. Not so lucky here on my advancing slides. So our Department of Environment and Climate Change adopts this kind of way of going about their prioritization of conservation, and they have these 7 themes, which they call the 7 R's. And those R's include representation. So what are the different components of biodiversity and where are they at in the province? They seek, where possible, to select areas that are roadless or relatively roadless. They look at elements of biodiversity, and that could be species or ecosystems that are rare. That's kind of where KBAs plug in. And particular parts of the landscape that are rich for biodiversity, so high concentrations of multiple elements of biodiversity, and KBAs, of course, plug in there as well. Last 3 are reconnection. So that's kind of some aspects of our biodiversity are quite isolated, functionally isolated in particular. So we seek to draw them together functionally by establishing connections. And it may seem kind of counterintuitive, but they actually look for redundancy to be built in. You don't want to put all your eggs in one basket in case something happens to that basket. So you build redundancy into the conservation plan. And lastly, restoration. So now I'm going to get into some of the conservation objectives for the department I work for. And I've got a lot of words on this screen, so I'll try to walk you through them. We phrase them as conservation outcomes. So this is what we want to see happen. And so on the left there in black, you see that what we're really looking to see is that all the different components of biodiversity persist on the landscape. And not just persist as in presence or absence, but persist at relevant scales and with relevant levels rather of variability. And the way we go about that is kind of broken down into these 5 different kind of sub-outcomes. And the first one is kind of broad-based in terms of natural resources in general, and sometimes we legally protect those natural resources, and other times we seek to manage them sustainably. Biodiversity, unfortunately, does sometimes decline, is degraded, and in some cases is being lost. And where we are aware of that, then we seek to avoid or mitigate those losses and declines. And sometimes to do that, we have to reduce or eliminate threats. And or if that's been implemented and things are still kind of not going so well, then we seek to recover or restore those elements of biodiversity. The last thing that I want to highlight, and it's really the main highlight for this slide, is that we seek to identify and prioritize globally, nationally, and provincially significant biodiversity. So that's really where KBAs come into play. And when I say significant biodiversity, I don't just mean significant from an ecological standpoint, but also societal interests sometimes come into play. And so an example, and I've highlighted in the middle there, is the beaver, which is a species that is harvested for its fur. And so we have to be cognizant of those societal interests when we set our priorities. And when we go about that, we work to ensure that our planning and decision making and management actions are underpinned by both scientific and traditional knowledge. And that happens through partnerships, consultation, collection and compilation of data, analysis of data. And we do a lot of that data collection ourselves, which is kind of nice. Some of my favorite parts of my job involve getting out and collecting data. Now this slide has got a lot of words and not so many pictures, so bear with me as I work my way through it. This is a slide that highlights the potential role of KBAs for establishing legally protected tracts of land, so wilderness areas or nature reserves. And so we are anticipating that KBAs could be quite important for protecting areas and helping us to achieve our target of 20%. And we're going to be using KBAs as one particular lens through which that ecological significance is assessed. And in doing so, we anticipate some challenges and opportunities that are going to come up. Many of the KBAs straddle a variety of different land tenures and uses. And so we anticipate that protection is just going to be one way of maintaining the value of those KBAs. We're going to have to use other measures to make things happen appropriately. And so some of the instances are not just the land tenures, but where there's a lot of interest in land use in a particular area where a KBA has been designated. So the value of the KBA process is that we know some of the areas we've already been focusing on for land protection, such as the Tusket River and Ponhook-Maliga are also KBA areas. But there's some new ones that we weren't looking at all, like the River Phillip KBA. And some other areas that we were aware of, but we didn't do too much because of some of the challenges with development and land use, so like Blackett's Lake.
Just given the 12-minute time warning.
Okay, I'll switch to my auctioneer speed voice. I'll try not to speak too quickly, but I want to highlight the Nova Scotia Biodiversity Act, and this is a new act also established in 2021. And I'm going to kind of showcase this and indicate how the KBAs could be important for helping us to realize one of the goals of this Biodiversity Act. So this is a new act, enables us to gives us an official mandate for conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity, and provides us with the authority to manage threats and risks. And one of the tools we have with this new act is called State of the Biodiversity Reporting. It looks like my thing jumped. So yeah, we have State of Biodiversity Reporting, and we are committed to delivering on that within the first 3 years. So within 3 years of when that act was brought in. And it's going to allow us to report on the status and trends of biodiversity in Nova Scotia, and in doing so, increase understanding of biodiversity and those issues concerning biodiversity in the province. And lastly, set the groundwork for monitoring in terms of biodiversity change, environmental change, changes in resource use, those kinds of things. So what are some of the areas where biodiversity areas, key biodiversity areas, could be important for State of Biodiversity Reporting, this new commitment that we have in Nova Scotia? The first is that new scientific understanding and data is being brought to bear. So information we didn't have previously is now in our suite of tools and in our kind of purview for moving things forward in this regard. It really helps that it's broadly endorsed by both the scientific and conservation communities and by other governments in Canada. One of the things that I kind of personally think is important is that it allows us to better recognize the global and national context. So this is kind of the backyard. You kind of sometimes look at your backyard and go, oh, there's nothing special there. But then you find out, hey, what you have in your backyard is not in anybody else's backyard across the country. And that kind of gives you a new type of insight into what's significant or not. And the flip side to that, sometimes you think something is pretty special, and then you find out, oh, it's everywhere. It's in Quebec, it's in Newfoundland. I'll just highlight the last one. What I really like is that it integrates multiple objectives that we have, multiple facets of biodiversity. So not just species at risk, but other types of species and ecosystems and our broader landscape objectives. Well, my last slide there, Peter, Mr. Timekeeper, and so bear with me for a few more seconds. This is a novel approach, a novel to us. KBAs have been around for a long time, quite a number of years, and in other parts of the globe. But this initiative is relatively new in Canada and especially new in Nova Scotia. So it's always good to look at things with a fresh set of eyes, especially when those eyes are well informed and we have a lot of good scientists involved. It's a new tool, not just guiding our assessment of biodiversity, but how we set priorities. And so that's important for 20% and a lot of other priorities that are as yet to be determined. We anticipate that it could be a possible touchstone for state of biodiversity reporting, a fantastic opportunity to increase collaboration and dialogue, such as what we're seeing with this session here today. And lastly, a very promising mechanism. This is and the one that resonates the most with me. A very promising mechanism to improve biodiversity conservation outcomes in this province and to contribute not just here, but in terms of biodiversity that we share with other jurisdictions in Canada. If we do a good job here, then it will improve those elements of biodiversity and their outcomes in the future elsewhere or overall. With that, I'm going to step off the rock and give it back to Peter.
Thank you so much, Sean. Really amazing presentation, and it's been really terrific to have such a great government partner to help advance the work of KBAs in Nova Scotia. Claire Wilson and Driscoll, I know, was in the audience as well, so thank you very much as well for all your help too. I am going to open it up for questions at the moment, and before I do that, I'm just going to drop in the chat emails for contacts if you'd like to follow up on different KBAs. I'll just note, Sean, you're still sharing, I think, the main screen. So if you want to completely exit your screen share, that'd be awesome.
Sharing.
Thank you. But yeah, for the audience, we have a lot of questions, so we'll make sure to get to as many of those as possible. We will have an extra half hour after the hour if you'd like to stick around. And I guess we'll start off with, I'm just going to allow everybody's mic and camera. So if you'd like to ask your question in person, just raise your hand and we'll get to you as soon as possible. We'll start off with some of the questions in the chat. Thank you for posting those questions. First one from Carol Allard, asking this, I guess, a question for Ciara. 10% of Canada, you had mentioned we're expecting to have coverage of 10% of Canada for KBAs. Is this including Canada's territorial seas and economic exclusionary zones or not?
Thanks for that question. And yes, no, I should have specified, and it certainly does not include those areas. So the Key Biodiversity Area program started with some seed funding from Environment and Climate Change Canada. So we were focused on terrestrial and freshwater systems. We are not limited to that anymore. We are identifying marine key biodiversity areas also, although they are a little bit more tricky to identify sometimes. So no, you're absolutely right. That was 10% of the terrestrial sort of part of Canada, and it is a pretty broad estimate.
Thank you. I see some hands up, so let's jump to those, and then we'll get to the questions in the chat in just a moment. Doug Hickman, do you want to go ahead? Doug, you should be able to unmute yourself if you'd like and ask away.
Thank you to everybody for the presentations, and just maybe a question or a comment to our colleague from the Department of Natural Resources and Renewables. We have quite a controversy in Nova Scotia between conservation priorities and the way that our forests are used, and we're not seeing very much progress, I frankly would say, in this from a conservation perspective and a biodiversity perspective. I would like to see some or hear some positive or comforting remarks from you on this. But given the history that we've had in this province with conflict on these issues, what I'm hearing is more monitoring going on, more science going on, more knowledge going on, but we're not getting any further on the action, notwithstanding the 20% goal. So maybe it's a comment, but I think we all need to see action, not just knowledge and science. And I really just want to put in a plug for that, and would be interested in what our departmental colleague has to say on that. Thank you.
Sean, I think you're muted still. Sorry.
Yeah, thank you for that. Could you just give me a sense of what organization you're representing, or where your perspective is coming from? That'd be good to know.
Well, my perspective comes from a court case regarding the mainland moose in Nova Scotia and the failure of the department to do anything about it since it was designated under the Species at Risk Act. We've now got a map and a range of mainland moose territory that should be considered for some type of protection, but on that specifically, I haven't heard of any further actions. We've got the actions that took place through the citizens group at Beals Brook, I believe it's called, over a period of several months to halt the logging there because of the suspected presence of endangered species, which were then found by citizens because the department didn't go to the forest to go look for itself, and because the forestry activities that are being undertaken are monitored by Westfor, which is actually the organization doing the cutting. So they're not about to go look for endangered species. So as I say, the science and the knowledge is welcome, and the initiatives and the policies are welcome. But while we have this, biodiversity is being put under a hammer in our province. We're not seeing the action.
Okay, well, I understand where your concerns are coming from, and I am aware of the court case, although not the specifics of it. What I will say is that I think I'll just kind of keep it to KBAs and how they relate to what we're trying to discuss today, and keep the focus there. So the KBAs are quite new. We don't know yet how we're going to move forward. It's a new lens, and I dare say that it's a new bit of information, and I understand where you're coming from in terms of you know, existing knowledge, existing science, existing information, and the need to have actions. Specific to KBAs, we don't yet know what those actions will be. I don't foresee any influence on species like moose because they are provincially listed, and this is a national initiative. So we have national and global KBAs, but provincially sensitive or at-risk species such as the moose are not triggers for KBAs.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Sean, and thank you, Doug, as well, for the comment and question. And thank you very much, Sean, for the response. We'll move over to Amanda. I think this is a great question for you. Karen McKendry is wondering, in Kespukwit, sorry if I've absolutely butchered the name, have you considered the Hectanuga cedar swamp? It's important for Canada warbler.
I don't know if that's an IBA, but if you look at the thresholds and the criteria, it might be important for Canada warbler, but it does have a huge threshold. So like Ciara was saying, it's kind of a scientifically defensible thing. So it's something we calculate based on the population. And it's quite a large number for Canada warbler. So as far as KBAs go, it would have to be a lot of Canada warblers to qualify. But yeah, I'm not sure. Is that an IBA? I didn't find one called that. No, okay.
Karen, if you're still on the call, feel free to jump on and elaborate on that. Not an IBA.
Yeah, sorry, not an IBA, an area of interest in Nova Scotia because it has eastern white cedar, which if you're from Ontario, another part of Canada, you have growing as your hedge. But here it's one of the only naturally occurring large assemblages of eastern white cedar, and then tracks a number of pairs of Canada warbler. So it's sort of at that intersection of like, is the plant on its own really rare? No. Is bird sightings on its own very rare? No. But combined in that spot, it makes for this sort of interesting collision between rarer plant and rarer bird.
Yeah. Yeah, I kind of already answered it with the threshold. Unfortunately, it's like very large. So if it is, there are other criteria too. If it is, one of the biggest sites or something like that, like range restricted species. But I know for Canada warbler, that's not the case. So.
As Sean pointed out, there are several very rare lichens there, and that's something that I'm happy to dig into more.
Thank you. Great responses, Amanda and Colin. Thank you very much, Karen. For anybody else interested, Amanda was talking about thresholds for how many birds it would take to trigger a KBA. I've just dropped in the chat a handy interactive web thingy. So if you'd like to search species and see how many mature individuals of a given bird species it'll take to trigger a KBA, feel free to play around with that. I'm going to skip to Carol Allard. I know you've had your hand up, so feel free to unmute yourself and ask away.
Thanks, and I'm also happy to wait till after the main body of the conversation to maybe have a bit more conversation. But one, I'm really excited. When I saw this, I was really happy to see some sites, start to emerge. I mean, the landscape is growing with KBAs, which is really wonderful. And I understand, the complexity of the science behind, the identification of these sites. So, but it's really great. I mean, there's progress being made in terms of highlighting, these areas that we know to be important, in addition to some new ones that I think are really kind of interesting in terms of either new areas altogether or the configuration of sites that's really promising in my mind. So I have a couple comments. I in the chat I had comments that were specific to the Cumberland IBA. I'm happy to kind of like go back and talk a little bit more about that. But I think I want to come back to a point that Sean raised, which I think is really critical. And I think it is, it is the impetus for ECCC support for this KBA work, is it's, the KBAs constitute a very compelling and defensible decision-making, decision support tool for targeting areas for enhanced conservation, whether that be protected areas or, as Sean mentioned, other stewardship measures, other effective area-based conservation measures, etc. And I do understand that because of the way things were laid out, that that there was considerable emphasis on terrestrial environments, but there are some really important coastal areas, and some of those actually figure quite prominently in the maps that we've seen today. But I've on a couple of occasions I've heard the mention of marine IBAs. If we look at the landscape of IBAs in Atlantic Canada, they are, if anything, only coastal and do not extend offshore. And I mean, there are reasons for this. You know, when used threshold-based approaches, the colonies host the concentrations of individuals that maybe achieve those criteria. But there's much more to it than that. And of course, as was mentioned by others in the chat, you know, there's the whole notion of important areas that are, you know, offshore of these coastal IBAs, beyond, out to the EEZ, that we also need to really highlight using this incredibly powerful and compelling tool. And DFO, as was identified, has invested decades of expertise, science, to identify ecologically and biologically significant areas throughout the Canadian landscape, but most certainly in Atlantic Canada. And some of the better efforts and more comprehensive efforts were conducted here in the Scotian Shelf marine bioregion, the Newfoundland Labrador Shelves bioregions. Coming back to Sean's point that KBAs can be used to, you know, to leverage, to empower, to generate action on the ground. The timelines are tight. We have resources now that are available to advance, to actually put to advance conservation on the ground. And I recognize that the process of identifying KBAs can take a long time. So I would invite you to really reach out to DFO and try to find a DFO and other partners that were involved in EBS identification to look at the potential for crosswalking these things quickly, so we can generate a more representative map of important areas for biodiversity in Canada, not just terrestrial areas. Otherwise, we just perpetuate this notion that that what we really care about is on the terrestrial landscape, which is simply not the case. Thanks.
Thanks, Carl. Go ahead, Ciara.
Yeah, just a quick response to that. Thank you very much for your comments, and I absolutely agree. And one of our basic premises in the work that we're doing is to not reinvent any wheels and to work and build upon the incredible biodiversity knowledge and tools that have been built before. EBSAs is one that we've actually had some difficulty with, and there's a bit of a history there. So right from the beginning, we tried to have DFO as a partner for this whole initiative, and because of their investment in EBSAs, they did not support key biodiversity area development. That's an ongoing conversation over the past 3 years. We believe that they're actually very different, and WWF Global has written a bit of a summary piece on sort of the differences between KBAs and other different kinds of tools like EBSAs, which are fantastic too. They're very good, but they are different. And so you're right that Atlantic Canada, the EBSAs are particularly well developed compared to even in the rest of the country, where they tend to be very large areas. They're closer to KBAs in Atlantic Canada than they are in the rest of the country, but the KBAs are still fully quantitative, and with very set criteria, whereas the EBSAs have a range of different approaches to get to that final sort of boundary. We are very cognizant of all the EBSAs, and we're very aware of where there may be overlaps, but we have to start from the elements that can actually trigger a key biodiversity area. And so we're doing that. We're not doing a crosswalk, and we could have maybe done that if there was more early involvement from DFO, but instead we are making sure that we don't sort of move forward without carefully considering the existing boundaries on the landscape, including EBSAs. So I think that what you're saying is absolutely right. I'm glad that you brought it up, so to give us the opportunity to say that we would very much welcome sort of even additional discussions, and especially in Atlantic Canada, and we will make sure that DFO is involved in sort of any of the sites that look like they should be aligned. But we have a couple of examples where the EBSAs are close to the KBA sort of boundaries, but there was no real justification for including the larger EBSA boundary. We had to be more specific. So we do see KBAs as being a little bit smaller often, and sort of the building blocks of things like EBSAs. They can provide sort of a strong argument for saying, yes, these EBSAs are absolutely like critical. They are key biodiversity areas for this and this. And so that we hope that we're strengthening those designations, and we're not trying to replace them. I think that they are a little bit different. I'd be happy to continue to talk about that, but we should not for the moment.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ciara. And again, Carl, for the great comment and response. I'll just quickly note to everybody, if you're on the call and you need to head off, thanks for joining. Thanks for sticking around. We'll continue along for another about 25, 26 minutes for more questions and discussion. So do stick around if you have the time, but thanks for joining if you have to leave. I'll hop to another question in the chat. And if anyone would like to ask their questions in person, just raise your hand and we'll get to that ASAP. But a great question from Kim Rabichaud-Leblanc. Would Atlantic whitefish still be a trigger species for the Tuskegee KBA, even though it's considered extirpated from this watershed? That's a great question, Kim. Key biodiversity areas, in general, all the criteria need to apply to what's presently at the site. And so extirpated species can't meet the KBA criteria if they're extirpated from a region. If there's a strong reason to believe that they might still be in the region, then there's a potential that the criteria might still qualify. But in general, if a species is gone from an area, then it can't figure into the KBA assessment for that particular site. But the KBAs will be reassessed, and it's always an ongoing process as their knowledge evolves and as species recover and distributions shift. So definitely, if there's ever a reintroduction or a reestablishment of Atlantic whitefish in that species, it could be added as a KBA trigger species to that site down the road. Going to another question. Carell, I'll leave your questions about the Upper Cumberland IBA. I think you might have addressed those already, but do feel free to just chime in if you want to still keep on discussing that with Amanda. EBSAs, great questions. Going on to a guest question. We know that DNRR does not in fact monitor endangered species in the context of logging operations and perhaps other operations. Witness the absence of DNRR comments on the recent Beals Brook logging operation and discovery of endangered lichen species by citizens in an effort to thwart logging in the absence of DNRR action. I don't think this is I'm not sure there's a question in there, but I think it probably speaks to the earlier comment that Sean addressed. So I think I'll leave that for now. But if you wrote that comment and you want to elaborate, please do chime in. I see Emma's raised her hand. Emma, go ahead, unmute yourself and ask away.
I just want to say that I was the biologist on the Beals Brook logging, the harvest plan that went through. And, we did send a lichenologist out, and, even the lichenologist wasn't able to find all the species of lichen that the essentially 200-day BioBlitz found. So, we're doing the best that we can with the information that we have. And I'm super excited about this idea of key biodiversity areas because, it gets people on the ground looking for more things. And I think it's a better way to manage, our landscape is looking not at things like, on an individual level, but on a more overarching one. So, yeah.
Thank you very much, Emma. Very, very appreciate the comments. Okay, question from Karen McKendry. Will the new KBAs in Nova Scotia examine the old IBP? Is that IBA or is this another acronym? Sorry. IBP sites of Nova Scotia. Does anyone know, is IBP an acronym of its own that's common in Nova Scotia?
It's International Biological Program, which is from 1969, which was an international effort that had some traction in Canada and in some provinces more than others. And I would say that, well, I'll leave it to Ciara to comment on application, but I would say that the criteria that were used for IBAs was quite mixed. So sometimes it was like an old growth forest stand that kind of made it into the portfolio. Other times it was the presence of a species that was rare at that time. Yeah, so a variety of different criteria and kind of a mixed outcome. I don't think that those are currently considered as they were originally assessed, and all of those areas have been looked at again. with new eyes and new understanding, new data, et cetera.
Here, go ahead.
I'll
Thank you,
just
Sean.
add one thing there. So I'm not so familiar with IBPs, but there have been 1 or 2 global efforts to do something like this. The Key Biodiversity Area program at the global scale is actually quite strong, and there's a couple of reasons to believe that it will have more traction and longer term traction. One is because of the groundwork that was laid by the IBA program, not the IBP program, and so that there is decades of experience identifying and stewarding these sites. And in Canada, there's caretaker networks associated with these, and we hope to, once we're past the science stage of identifying the sites, which is a huge effort, and this goes back to Doug's comment, we will be switching. And now that there are other, WCS Canada is a science organization, but we have people in the Key Biodiversity Area Coalition and organizations that are more on the action side of things and stewardship, and sort of trying to figure out how to make sure that this biodiversity is not lost. At the global scale, they're right now discussing the global biodiversity framework, which is the decade of what are we going to do in the next 10 years to avoid biodiversity loss. Currently, Key Biodiversity Areas is actually the term is being put back into one of the main targets for the global biodiversity area, global biodiversity framework. I'm not sure if it'll stay there, but will remain at least at the indicator level. And so this is something that all countries agree to. 196 countries are signatories to the Convention on Biological Diversity, and so there is a global database, global maps. There's a lot of reporting. If you go to the Convention on Biological Diversity technical and scientific meetings, most countries are reporting back because on KBAs, or how much of their KBAs are stewarded, how much resources are going into the protection of KBAs, how much protected area coverage or other area-based management sort of approaches are targeting KBAs. And it's because it's one of the only indicators that is trusted very broadly, because it doesn't matter who actually does the work of identifying these sites. So I do think that both Canada and at the global scale, KBAs are here to stay, and I think I have great hope that this will be a very useful information layer for a lot of different reasons. Again, not the only one that we need, but a very important one.
Thank you very much, Ciara. Another question in the chat, more for Colin. Is the Hectanuga swamp included in the Tusket River KBA? It also houses a number of very rare lichens. Is that a site on your radar, Colin?
It's one. Yeah, that's a site that did not come up during our lichen workshop. It's a important site that I'm aware of. I'm not explicitly aware of populations there and whether they meet thresholds or not. So that's something that I'd be happy to chat more about with someone who has some site-specific experience. But as it stands now, it's not one of the most low-hanging fruit type. So that's definitely one to explore more. I know it's an important spot, and I'm happy to talk about it more. It's not in the Tusket River KBA.
Thank you. So if there are more questions, please drop them in the chat or raise your hand. Not seeing any others in the chat. Ciara, go ahead.
Sorry, I was actually wanting to, because there was a question about moose, and so moose are provincially designated, not nationally designated. But I did want to make one other comment about that, because it might apply to other types of biodiversity that people may be thinking of, which is that so Key Biodiversity Areas is very much a site-scaled approach to conservation, which is shown to be a very effective scale at which conservation can sometimes work, because there are lots of stakeholders and rights holders who can push for different kinds of stewardship at a site. It's not necessary, it doesn't need to be a protected area, but sometimes it needs attention and monitoring. And so any kind of species that require more landscape scale management, and that includes moose or any far-ranging species that doesn't concentrate at the site scale, there won't be a Key Biodiversity Area for those particular species unless they gather at a certain part of their life cycle, like caribou do for birthing in some cases, then you might get a KBA. So I just wanted to mention that, just because, you know, as people become familiar with key biodiversity areas, they may be thinking, oh, how about this and how about that? And that's exactly what we want. In the future, we believe that most KBAs will be identified by people like you who realize, oh, this really should be a key biodiversity area. We're doing this initial kind of push, but we think it's, you know, it should eventually be in the hands of, you know, local scientists and regional scientists, the people who know the sites and the species and the ecosystems the best. So we look forward to that future.
Thank you. And I'll note as well, if you're interested in learning more about the KBA criteria and the different, you know, particular standards and specific criteria, definitely check out the KBA Canada website, kbacanada.org. There's a key documents page that has all of kind of the essential documentation and methods and standards that we follow to identify KBAs. So do check that out if you're interested in learning more, or chat with any of us, and we're always happy to chat more as well and dive more into it with you. We'll give people a couple more questions to either drop questions in the chat or raise their hand if they have anything else. In the meantime, maybe Amanda, I'll turn it over to you and just, I think you've addressed this in the chat already, but Carol was asking about Upper Cumberland Basin IBA in Amherst, Nova Scotia. Has this site been assessed as a KBA, and do you have any updates on the status of that?
Yep, all of our sites have been assessed. If I look at that map and type in the thing, yeah, so it's going to be nominated as a global KBA for semi-palmated sandpiper, and it looks like we have enough data to nominate it. So yeah, if anyone has extra data they want to submit, or if they have anything to say about the site summary, that map that Peter sent around is actually now editable. So if you have comments on any of the text that we have, we get that in a form, so you can just click the icon and make comments on it. And then there's a big red button that says review site. So if you have any extra information about that, about any sites that you saw on our map today, then yeah, we'd be happy to get your input. You can also just email me if you'd like to ask more questions about what those reviews and stuff are about. I kind of answered the question, but went on a rant too.
Super, thank you very much, Amanda. And I've dropped those maps again in the chat there, so if you're interested, please do check them out. Carell, ask away.
Yeah, I'm going to take advantage of the opportunity. This is fantastic, and thank you so much for, comprehensive responses to questions. I wanted to ask Sean a bit of a question because, he, like myself, were conservation planners. We're trying to kind of envision, networks of conservation, that include protected areas. But the KBA is only one layer. It's one element in a long suite of important considerations as we kind of lay out, what we believe, based on the evidence might be required to ensure the long-term viability of our ecosystems. And I really appreciated the 7 R's that you presented, Sean, that include considerations beyond rarity and richness. And when I look at the KBA map, I'm excited to see these sites that we recognize are important, as well as a few new ones. But what I don't see are elements like representation, are elements like connectivity. When we talk about discrete, you're in, you're out. That means that that gap between KBAs is not a KBA, and it conveys a sentiment that area is not key. So it's not important when we clearly know it is. And also, the concept of replication and restoration or even resilience and building that into these sites. We need to be climate smart. And I understand that the KBA is very specific in terms of what it is meant to do, in terms of characterizing what we know right now. But we also have pretty good sense of, you know, what sea level rise means, of where, you know, some of our coastal ecosystems will require accommodation space or landward migration. We need to build these into very compelling maps that would be complemented with KBAs. My fear is that this very powerful tool, takes up a lot of attention or garners a lot of attention and distracts from other really key conservation planning conversations that also involve large groups of stakeholders and rights holders, et cetera, that need to happen. But my fear is sometimes when we celebrate, these sites, these very discrete sites, we can undermine, the emphasis that needs to be maintained on these other locations that for all of the other R's that Sean presented really need to be front and center. If anything, more so now than ever before, because the opportunities for conservation are now. They may not be the same. We can't expect that they will be there, 5 or even 10 years from now. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Carl. Very excellent comments and very well taken, I think. I'm sure Ciara and maybe even Sean wants to jump in on that, but I'll just say as well off the bat, I think that's something we're really cognizant of as well and trying to remain aware of. KBAs are a great tool and one that's hopefully will be really helpful and synthesizes a lot of previous tools into a single package, but it's definitely not the only tool that we need for conservation. And there are definitely things like connectivity, like you say, like climate change and climate connectivity as well, and biocultural values especially too. A lot of other things that KBAs don't capture very well and that we will need complementary tools for to address those other R's that Sean had in his presentation. So yeah, very well taken comments, and something we're trying to make sure we don't lose sight of all the other important things as we're getting excited about KBAs moving forward too. Ciara, Sean, anything you guys want to add as well?
Sean, go ahead.
Yeah, I had to write things down. Carell touched on so many hot button, very poignantly said, and very astute comments. That firstly, I just want to say, Carell, you are warmly welcome to come and visit us anytime in Kentville, and we look forward to collaborating more with ECCC. So I don't interact too much with you folks, and so it'd be really great to get this kind of dialogue happening more. I think it's important, and those ideas of yours are fantastic. So anytime, we could go to the field too, by the way. So I think that KBAs are important in a variety of respects, but they've been implemented at the global and national level, and we're a small jurisdiction. So in some respects, we could feel as though we're kind of fortunate to have such a well represented diversity of different KBAs kind of mapped out in this little province, this little part of Canada. But to me, it begs the question as to whether or not there are other key biodiversity areas that can be recognized with scale-specific criteria for an area the size of Nova Scotia, and particularly, whether or not that lens is, could be extended to other provinces as well, but using kind of things that we recognize as important in Nova Scotia. So I think that's kind of one thing that's relevant, and we have tried to do that to some extent. But the difficulty rather is quantifying significance. And when you have to do that, you need thresholds. And when you come up with those thresholds, then you have to defend those thresholds. And you don't always have the data or the science to back them up. And so that's why we're really happy to buy into the KBA process. And it just means we have that much more of a challenge to initiate similar processes for other more scale relevant, provincial scale relevant identification of key biodiversity areas. So so that's kind of like a side benefit, I think, to this initiative. So we have the mapping that's been done through WCS and its partners, but that could serve as a catalyst for looking at the landscape in similar ways, but with slightly different criteria. And so hopefully that's one mechanism to address the remainder of the landscape, which is going to be, the large representation of the landscape is not going to fall in KBA. So we got to do something there as well. I fully agree.
So I'll just add one thing, which is that, well, as you know, because you're at ECCC, there are a number of working groups working on, for example, a connectivity indicator that could be applied at the national scale. So that's as part of the Pathway to Canada Target 1. And we originally had sort of, been working together quite a lot with the connectivity working group and with the IPCA working group as well to try to eventually move towards something similar. And I was part of an initiative as well to look at ecosystem services, which is another aspect that we should be looking at in addition to all the others. So I don't actually believe that focusing on KBAs or providing more information that's very trusted and robust from a scientific perspective will necessarily lead to perverse outcomes. I think the more information, the better. And I agree with Sean that we need to get better at those other indicators, but they're much more complex to implement at these different scales. So that is connectivity, certainly a national standard or even a global standard on biocultural indicators does not seem appropriate even, but it's something that absolutely needs to be taken into account in any decision at the local or regional level. So I think providing data or providing information is always a good thing. What then happens with that and how it's combined with other sources of information, that needs to be done in a really wise way and it will be different in each place. But we have heard the same thing, the sort of same concerns as what you're bringing to us at other regional ECCC offices, which I find interesting. It is because people know their landscapes very well and they know what the major considerations are, and that's where therefore the decisions and sort of exploration of what those indicators should be taking place. But I sincerely hope that KBAs don't provide any perverse incentives to do the wrong thing in these landscapes. I think these sites are places where there is a real risk of biodiversity being lost from the planet. And so making sure that people know where those places are, I think, is really important.
Thank you both very much. And thanks again, Carol, for the great comment and question. Very much appreciated. So we're coming up on close to the end of the half hour, have about 4 minutes left. Jump to one more question that's in the chat from Alice Morgan. How are KBA boundaries determined? She noticed that, or they noticed that Briar Island KBA was a circle and the Tusket was more of a landscape shaped lakeshore and riparian areas. Great question, and I can jump on that first, and then Colin, if you want to speak more specifically to Tusket, and Amanda maybe to Briar Islands, then we can touch on that after. But the KBA boundaries are first and foremost, when we're making them from scratch, ecologically relevant, and so they're kind of designed and shaped and drawn with this particular species that are meeting KBA criteria in mind. The idea is that they follow some sort of ecologically relevant boundary or habitat relevant boundary for that species at the site, and form an area that's around a site of disproportionate importance for the species. The second consideration that we use after ecological relevance is kind of management relevance as well. So the idea is that we're designating shapes and key biodiversity areas that are sites that can be manageable as a unit, whatever that means. Some KBAs are quite small, others are very large, and there's, obviously species to species and area to area, a lot of, gray area around what a site actually means. But the idea is that the KBAs are ecologically relevant and management relevant. In the case of Briar Islands, we also, are building off of the IBAs, important bird and biodiversity area work that's gone on before, and so Briar Island was an offshore waters was an IBA, and so the Key Biodiversity Area really bases itself off of that shape, and there's a small extension made for some of the vascular plants that Colin mentioned are also present at that site. For our newer sites like Tusket River that were not IBAs before, Colin's really going from scratch and building off the work of Ciara Robinson as well before, who was our coordinator. And designating these, kind of drawing out these shapes with input from experts and others. Amanda, Colin, anything you guys want to say about those sites in particular?
I'll just quickly add that some of the coastal ones have this big buffer around them, and that's intentional. BirdLife International had guidance for certain species that use the water around the island as well. So that's why there are some buffers for some of the coastal ones.
I think Peter explained it pretty well for my end of things. Yeah, it's really just based on the trigger species and what is relevant to them, habitat-wise, ecology-wise. So that's why we get something different.
Terrific. Well, I think we'll leave it at that then. We're at kind of in the last, very last minute. So I'll give a huge thank you to all of our speakers today, Sean, Amanda, Colin, Ciara. Thank you very much. Thank you everybody who joined for the terrific discussions and questions. I think we're all always happy to continue these discussions anytime. So do reach out to any and all of us if you're interested in learning more and chatting more. I've dropped the emails in the chat one last time, and there's also a short survey if you're interested in participating more in the process and having us reach out to you. Do fill out that short survey. Otherwise, thank you very much for joining. A special thanks as well to Claire Wilson O'Driscoll and Dave McKinnon as well, who have been working with us with Sean. Thank you very much for all the support. And take care, and everybody have a great day. Enjoy a piece of nature near you, and hopefully KBA near you as well.
Thank you, Peter. You did a great job.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you all. Thank you. Thanks everyone for coming. It was very lovely to talk to you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Take care.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.